Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Um, my plan for this evening is to run through a little bit of my background with maybe just a little bit more detail than what Sarah provided, and then also tell you more about the work that I'm doing now, specifically in Ethiopia with the Glimmer of Hope Foundation. And I'll just pause throughout for questions and conversation. I'm going to take a very informal approach, so feel free to um, interrupt at any time. So thanks so much for having me, and thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I attended the University of North Texas. I'm originally from Arlington, Texas, and I'm joining you now from Austin. I moved here in 2013. Like Sarah said, my degree is in English literature, so it was a bit of a mystery what the plan was after I graduated from school, and I kind of fell into my career, but I'm really happy that I did. So once I moved to Austin, I started working for a community-based nonprofit here in town that focused on helping people re-enter the workforce after leaving incarceration. And so I was playing a social work role in that position. And after some time in that role, I developed my skills into a grant writing role. And that's when I first got a little bit of a taste of fundraising and realized that that was something that I was really interested in. Um, so I really enjoyed doing that. While I was in the grant writing role there at that community-based nonprofit, most of my day-to-day looked like writing grant proposals. We submitted about 70 grant proposals or so a year, just trying to attain funding to fund the reentry programs that we were providing for people. We also, during the time that I was there, launched an adult high school. It was a really cool effort to be a part of, where we lobbied to pass a law to allow adults over the age of 25 to attain a high school diploma. So that was an effort that we focused on based on the fact that so many people in Texas lack a high school diploma, and also therefore prohibited from attaining employment because of low education rates. So that was a cool thing to work on as well. And as I grew in that role, I sort of pivoted to focus more on corporate fundraising and family philanthropy. And I spent about 4 years doing that work. And then from there, I shifted over to a corporate foundation. So that's when I joined Whole Foods Market and started working on the team at Whole Planet Foundation. And as Sarah mentioned in my intro, Whole Planet Foundation's focus is on supporting women entrepreneurs to start or expand small businesses in the communities where Whole Foods sources their products. And so that was a pretty cool and interesting pivot for me, going from a community-based nonprofit to an organization that works around the world. It was a pretty steep learning curve, but a cool opportunity at the same time. So while I was on the team at Whole Planet Foundation, I also did fundraising. So I focused there more on large-scale events and produced about half a dozen big events every year. And I also focused on volunteers and community awareness raising. So things like I created a committee to get people more involved from the community in Whole Planet Foundation's work, and educate more people on what microcredit is. And then after a couple years, then I transitioned to the role that I'm in now at Glimmer of Hope Foundation, which is a family foundation. So one thing that I've found to be really interesting over the course of my career in the about last 7 years is both the pivot from working in direct social services to being kind of more behind the scenes and admin within nonprofit organizations, and also that experience that I've had being both local and international in both corporate foundation and also family foundation and community-based nonprofit. So do you guys have any questions about any of that stuff before I jump into what I'm doing now at Glimmer of Hope? Yeah, okay. I'm going to send a link in the chat for the website for Glimmer, if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, there's the link to the website just in case anybody wants to check it out while I talk a little bit about Glimmer. So I joined Glimmer about 2 years ago after having the experience with Whole Planet Foundation of visiting programs in other countries where we were doing microcredit and learning about how important it was to provide financial services to people in other communities around the world. I didn't fully realize what lack of infrastructure within financial services there was in some places, and what the implications of that are. So not being able to have savings means not being able to respond when shocks happen to people's income that can affect food security for their families and so forth. So once I got a little bit of a taste of the importance of that, I was excited to kind of grow in that aspect of my career and support missions that were really focused on opening up those opportunities for families and especially women. So I joined Glimmer about 2 years ago. And one thing that was really appealing to me was Glimmer's specific focus on working in Ethiopia. That was a really unique thing to me. And I had a lot of questions about why Ethiopia when I first joined the team. So Glimmer of Hope was actually created by a family who sold their company in the early 2000s and took about half of the income that they earned from that and started a family foundation. And they specifically really wanted to work in Ethiopia because the founders were growing up during the Ethiopian famine, and they watched the Live Aid concerts, and it just was something that they really connected with, that idea that people in other parts of the world lacked just basic access to services, income, and food. And so the foundation was created. So just a little bit more about Ethiopia specifically. Within the country, almost 80% of the people live in really rural communities. And so by nature of being in such rural communities, they tend to have a lack of infrastructure in those areas. And so there's a lot of opportunities for development around education and health and financial institutions. Another thing that's really unique about Ethiopia is that about half of the population is under age 25. So there's a lot of opportunity for a labor force there. And yet, since so much of it is rural, most of the people who live there are subsistence farmers. And so therefore, lack of food security and income can be quite a challenge. Another thing that's really interesting about Ethiopia is it has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And just last year, the prime minister of the country won a Nobel Peace Prize. So there's a lot of development that's happening there really rapidly. And it makes it a great country to invest in for those reasons. And then the last reason that Ethiopia has a lot of potential is just its geographic location. So it's in the Horn of Africa, so Northeast Africa, and it's positioned to have really good access to Asia and the Middle East for business opportunities. So I tell you a little bit about that just to give you a background on why Glimmer is so focused on developing the local economy and livelihoods there. Any questions? So some of the challenges that Ethiopia still faces, like I mentioned before, the health and the education infrastructure there is extremely weak. So there's just a lack of resources in the country in that regard. Many of the communities, especially the rural communities, the classrooms are often outside under trees, or they're falling down, and just not safe environments for children to learn in. Many students, especially girls, drop out of school by the time they get to 8th grade just because of lack of opportunity. Women and girls have an exceptional burden within the household and within the society. And so, for example, girls can walk up to 2 hours a day just to collect water for their families. So there's just a huge challenge there as well. And then the other thing that's really challenging that kind of ties into you guys' focus on the environment this month is the environmental impacts that people in Ethiopia experience, and as the climate continues to change, how they're kind of unduly burdened with that. So, for example, right now they're experiencing floods and swarms of locusts in rural communities that are wiping out their food supplies. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to teach people new skills and help move us kind of into the 21st century in farming and climate smart farming. And so that's something that Glimmer works on as well. So what we do specifically on the ground in Ethiopia is We have a team of about 25 people that work for Glimmer that are based in Addis Ababa, which is the capital of the country. And they work to identify the communities where we'll work. And then we go into a community for about 5 to 7 years, and we take an integrated approach to development. So we focus on health, education, and rural agricultural livelihoods. So our objective is to strengthen the community's resource and capacity around all three of those sectors. So within the livelihoods focus, we strengthen existing financial institutions, which are usually institutions like locally run co-ops or informal loan and savings organizations. And so Glimmer will come in and both infuse capital, but also provide training for those organizations. And then we create loan programs. So we provide small business loans to the farmers in those communities to engage in different value chain activities and increase and diversify their assets. So for example, we might provide loans for people in a community to purchase a cow and start a small dairy business. And then in addition to providing the capital for them to develop their business, we also provide technical training and ongoing assistance and coaching for the families in those communities. We take a focus on climate smart practices as well. So teaching people things like crop rotation so the soil can regain its health, and just concepts like that. We provide things also like diverse seeds as well for farming. And then within health, we focus specifically more than anything on women and children. So we provide nutrition training and teach mothers the importance of breastfeeding and delivering babies in health facilities if at all possible. We also do a lot of infrastructure development around construction, so building health posts and health facilities within rural communities. And then we also train both local government and health volunteers who then take the skills and the knowledge that they have and are able to go house to house and educate other people in their community. And then the last thing that we do is our focus on education. So a lot of the work that we do in education, like health, is around increasing access through construction of schools, especially secondary schools, which tend to be harder to access for people in rural communities. And then, interestingly, we also invest in building latrines in schools. So many schools don't have access to running water or toilets. And so that's a big priority for us. And one reason for that is because having latrines in schools supports girls to continue to be educated after the age of menstruation. And so that's an important thing for retaining girls in schools. And then the last thing we do is establish girls' clubs where girls can go to learn about gender issues and also become ambassadors and train their peers at their schools. Do you guys have any questions about Glimmer's approach to work in Ethiopia?
You may have this to touch on later on, but how does your volunteer system work? Do you have people that are stationed there year round? Or do people go back and forth? And where do those people come from?
Mm-hmm. Volunteers for Glimmer?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, we're more focused on empowering local community members to do some of the volunteer work rather than people from the States, perhaps. So part of what we do is we have a principle called community-led development, where we engage, like I mentioned, local government, but also local community leaders. So a diverse group of community leaders like youth and people in positions of power at the church and other institutions like that to help shape our programs. So the first thing that we do when we go to a community is meet with the people there and get input from them on what the needs are in the community and what their commitment will be to helping with the work. And so there's a combination of things that local community members contribute, but we always ask that they contribute both work, labor, and volunteer hours, and also contribute capital to the project. So they'll commit both money and time. So a little bit different than a traditional volunteer model that you would see at a local community-based nonprofit. And then I guess the other way that we engage people in our work, like in person, is we take donor trips every year where we bring those who support our work at a financial level to come to go see the work on the ground in Ethiopia. So we weren't able to do that this year because of COVID, obviously, but typically we'll go over there at least once a year and show our work to our donors in person. Thanks for asking.
Ellen, I have a question.
Yes.
There are some economists who say that one of the root causes of poverty in Ethiopia and in other African nations is lack of recognized property rights, real property rights, the ability to buy land and guarantee that title with surveys, with recorded deeds, the ability to buy and sell real estate, knowing that any investment on that real estate is going to be protected by the government from people who try to seize it, whether it's a government official or some other individual or entity. Can you talk about that if you have any knowledge about real property in Ethiopia and what that means to, if there's a relationship to poverty or what you've observed relating to the ownership of real property?
Yeah, I'll speak to that to the best of my ability. That's definitely very true, and that there's a lack of personal property in the community, and so many people don't have the resources of property to even farm, which is their main opportunity for earning income. Um, and that's particularly a challenge with youth and the people who are in the deepest situations of poverty. Um, Within the last few years, the government has slowly opened up and deregulated a bit. So has continued to transition from a communist government to a democratic republic. And so we're optimistic that people's property rights will continue to be strengthened over time as long as we can continue to trend in that direction. There's a lot of interesting political challenges that come into play in working in Ethiopia. For example, the country is broken up into different regions, and those regions have different cultural heritages and often speak different languages and have different ethnic and religious makeups. And so one ongoing challenge that has been really acute lately is the cohesion of the country overall. And so within just the last few months, there's been a bit of violent political unrest in the country. And so I think for those of us that are working there, we're kind of holding our breath and seeing if we continue to trend into this direction of opening up the economy and giving more rights to people for things around property, but also other key issues in the country, or if we're going to backslide a little bit, especially in the face of COVID and the environmental challenges that they've been experiencing lately. So that's about as much as I can speak to on that, but thank you, and you're absolutely right that is a challenge.
So as an ag major, I have a couple questions about like y'all's farming practices. And so like I know whenever I was taking my agronomic plant science, one thing that was emphasized to us was proper irrigation techniques and then rarely tilling the soil because it keeps the natural fertilizer and stuff. I don't know your knowledge on that, but like, and also I know you mentioned diverse seeds. I'm a big advocate for genetically engineered crop seeds, especially in those underfunded countries where resources are limited. So is that something y'all include in your seeds? And just like I just want to know more about y'all's agriculture aspects, basically.
Yeah, those are great questions. Irrigation is a component of our sustainable agriculture focus. Only about 1% of the land in Ethiopia is actually irrigated. So that's a great question, and it contributes tremendously to food insecurity that people rely on rainfall in order to be able to harvest their crops. And especially as rain patterns have changed pretty drastically in the last, probably decade that people have really noticed, that's put food security under even more threat. And so irrigation and responsible irrigation is a really big component of Glimmer's work. And as our both genetically engineered and improved seeds and also cattle. So another thing that we do is we build vet clinics, and we also provide improved cattle breeds for the loans that we provide for farmers. And there are a lot of positive environmental impacts that go along with both of those. Yeah, and I'll just add that we were already evolving and growing in the direction of starting to think a lot more about climate when we were looking at our sustainable livelihoods approach, but it became really acute this year as Ethiopia experienced floods, droughts, a locust infestation, and landslides, and then COVID, like all within the last several months. And it started to become really, really apparent that there's just no way to do sustainable livelihoods in Ethiopia without thinking about the climate, like as a lens that you look at your approach through. Did that give you a little more information?
Yes, actually, thank you.
Good, cool, thanks.
Hi, Elaine. This is Ramiro here. I have a question. You mentioned about the credits that you give to the farmers or other people. What is the difference in the interest rate that they receive in local banks, for example, or local people versus what you are giving to them? What is the benefit that they have in continuing doing their credit with you?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question, and I will try to answer it without getting too in the weeds. But a lot of what you see in developing countries is access to loans and savings and other financial products through microfinance institutions, which are typically these large international institutions and banks that provide loans to like in broad strokes across the country or across large areas within a country. And so Glimmer has worked with microfinance institutions in the past, but in 2018, we evolved our approach to focus on establishing more community-based financial institutions. So rather than these larger financial institutions that serve people across broad areas, we started to understand the importance of having local financial institutions that both unions and cooperatives that provide services right where they are and pay dividends to the communities that they're in. And so typically cooperatives and unions have lower interest rates than microfinance institutions do. And as I mentioned, they pay dividends locally to their members, and they're typically also volunteer run within the leadership positions within the organization. And so there's a lot of social capital that's built with having local financial institutions. In regards to specific interest rates, I think in a community where we're working with a microfinance institution, I think the interest rates on the loans are between about 15 and 20%, whereas they tend to be about 12 or 13% with cooperatives and local financial institutions. So they're also a bit lower. The challenge with working with those local financial institutions is, as I mentioned, typically they're run by volunteers, and they just have less access to capital to create more loans. And so that's why part of Glimmer's approach involves both training the folks who run those financial institutions, but also infusing capital to create a revolving fund so that after we leave the area, there is still capital there to continue to create loans. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I have one more question. I'm sorry. So I'm an ag education major. So I'm just curious about, like, I know you mentioned y'all have people there training them, like if you give them a dairy cow, how to probably milk the cow, feed it, how to get the most out of that dairy cow, and vice versa with probably market cattle as well, and farming techniques. So who do y'all have educating? I know you said y'all try to do local based stuff. So who would be an expert in Ethiopia, I guess?
Yeah, okay, great. I'm glad you asked about that. So part of our approach is to work with local development organizations within the regions where our projects are. So the Ethiopian government is pretty strict about nonprofits just coming in and doing work in the country without a good established presence. And so Glimmer's been there for 20 years. And so that creates a lot of opportunities for us. So some of the experts that lead the efforts within our sustainable livelihoods sector are the experts from the development organizations within the regions where we're working, so their staff. And then another thing that we do is we hire what we call community facilitators from the local communities where we're working as well. So people who have experience in agriculture and are able to provide ongoing technical assistance and training. And so part of that looks like the initial training that the farmer gets when they take out the loan and they get their productive asset, whether it's a cow or seeds. But then the community facilitator also provides ongoing technical assistance. So part of their job is to go home to home frequently and check on the status of the activities that the farmer is doing. And while they're there, they might show them how to like plant seeds more effectively, or correct what they're feeding their livestock or something like that. And then another thing that we do is we establish little small neighborhood-based social support groups called Village Economic and Social Associations. And those are like informal, like I said, social groups that are support groups for the people in the neighborhood who have loans. So if everybody on this call lived in the same neighborhood and we all had a loan, we would all be part of the same group. And we would meet frequently, and the conversation would be somewhat freeform, but there is a curriculum that also guides those conversations, and it's all around best practices in farming, what to be aware of within the climate and rain patterns and things like that. And there's also topics related to both health and education for the family as well. And that's an opportunity for us to just support each other to be successful in repaying our loan, and then hopefully taking out another loan to continue to diversify our income over time. And then the last little thing that those groups do is they have a very small little pool of savings that they create together that's like an emergency support loan for if anybody in the group has some kind of emergency come up where they need to borrow money from the group for like school fees for their children or something like that. So that's another area where we really focus on building social capital to help people be successful and learn from one another. And that's also a really key component of sustainability when we leave the program area is that social capital.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really cool.
Ellen, I think that's a key component, what you just described. I've heard of this before. It's a small working group. It creates peer pressure, peer incentives, a desire to please the group. It creates accountability. It's a wonderful tool. Whoever thought of that is gifted. I mean, that aside from microloans, that's a key component of making sure that it works. Talk about corruption for a second. What is the level of corruption you see locally, in the state level, and talk about what someone who's trying to get ahead encounters, and if anything can be done. And maybe along with that, how does banking work? You talked about banking just a little bit, but where do people keep their money? How do they transact business? Do they use cell phone accounts, cell phone websites? How do they get things done and keep their money and protect it?
Yeah. In regards to corruption, I can only speak from my experience with Glimmer. And I think that one thing that we've done really, really right is engaging the people of Ethiopia in our work from the very beginning. And so because we have a team of 25 Ethiopian people in leadership in the country that really guide the day-to-day of our work, a lot of those issues we're able to kind of sidestep. And it really also facilitates close monitoring of our programs on the day-to-day in country, because we have people who are able to go and visit and see the work at play. So I can't even think of any example that I've ever been aware of where corruption has been an issue. I know that when I worked at Whole Planet Foundation, we had challenges with sometimes leadership at microfinance institutions in terms of like transparency and the funding. And you're absolutely right that is an issue. But I haven't encountered it since I've been with Glimmer of Hope. And then in terms of the way that banking works, so like I mentioned, Glimmer is working specifically in these really rural communities. So typically people might not have any access to financial services, or they might have really, really weak financial services in the area. And so part of our focus is increasing the access and strengthening the capacity of those institutions, as I mentioned before. In terms of digital banking, that's something that we're really looking at trying to get more connected with and exploring more in the future, just because when people are in such rural communities, it can be otherwise really challenging to connect with them. So that's a cool and exciting kind of like cutting edge thing that's been happening for a little while, but continues to really rapidly evolve in rural communities. I know that was a bit general. Those are my thoughts on that. Did I answer your questions, or do you have any follow-up questions?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think one other thing about digital tools that's really cool is there are also a lot of opportunities in addition to using cell phones for banking in rural communities. There's also the option or the opportunity to communicate information to communities around agriculture. So things like providing text alerts for changing rain patterns or locusts, and also reminding farmers when to harvest their crops or best practices within farming. And so that's another thing that we're seeing other development institutions do in these rural communities in developing countries, is employ tools like that. The last thing that I'll mention about digital solutions is that currently Glimmer is using, we're using tablets for our community facilitators so that we can continue to really closely monitor our programs and have a kind of a feedback loop in place. So those community facilitators that I mentioned before that are going home to home and visiting farmers and seeing how they're doing, how they're progressing with their loan products, they're also asking questions about things like, is your child attending school? Do you have enough food in the home? If you had a child born in your home in the last year, did you deliver the baby at home or did you deliver it in a health facility? So part of what the community facilitator does, in addition to providing technical assistance for farmer families, is use their tablets to collect data on those farmer families so that we can continue to track their progress. And if we see a trend of people not repaying their loans on time, or we see that families aren't sending their kids to school, then that gives us the opportunity to ask the question of why and do additional due diligence and kind of investigation into what might be going on in that particular community to cause those challenges. So that's another cool thing that we're able to do with digital tools, and our goal is to continue to just make that even more robust over time.
Does Glimmer work with other NGOs in Ethiopia? I mean, do you find all the other NGOs and pull everybody together and say, what are you doing? We're doing this. We'll help you. You help us. Is there a network?
Yeah, there are several networks that we're engaged in. One of them is called the Movement for Community-Led Development, and that is mainly made up of other NGOs that are international nonprofit organizations that come together around best practices for just that, which is community-led development. Another thing that I didn't yet mention is that Glimmer's programs, our programs are typically 5 to 7 years, and they're very large-scale, multi-million-dollar programs. And so the way that we're able to do those programs is we do have institutional donors, like other foundations, that help fund the work that we're doing. And one huge benefit of working with foundations is that they tend to have really large portfolios of grantees. And so a lot of the best practices that we are learning are around connecting with other grantees from our donors. And so, for example, I've mentioned a few times our work in climate focus and also our continued evolution in that direction. We started to learn a lot more about best practices in climate smart agriculture from other grantees of the IKEA Foundation, who's one of our funders. So in the last couple of years, the IKEA Foundation really shifted their focus to be a lot more conscientious and thoughtful about their impact on the climate in the grants that they were making. And they started to fund a lot more organizations that were doing that kind of work. And so we saw an opportunity to connect with both IKEA, but also some of their other grantees, and just have, informal interview conversations around their approach and learn best practices from those peer organizations. So that's a huge component of the work that we're doing. I think there is the challenge or the misconception sometimes that nonprofits are slowest to evolve, they're the slowest to adopt new technologies. But that definitely doesn't have to be the case. And I think that one way to maintain our relevance and continue to innovate is definitely working with peer organizations to learn what others are doing. So thanks for asking about that.
We also have a question in the chat, Ellen, from Elizabeth. How do you work with individuals or groups where they aren't able to follow through on the commitments, like paying loans? What's your intervention approach, and how do you help them get back on track?
That's a great question, and it's extremely relevant right now because with the COVID challenges that we've had and also political unrest in Ethiopia over the past 6 or 7 months, we're facing that exact challenge. In our communities, our repayment rate on loans right now is about 30%, which is drastically low compared to the normal about 88%. And I mean, the challenges of COVID have been really immense for everybody, regardless of where you live. And so what we've been doing is both responding to provide emergency assistance to communities with things directly related to COVID, like medical supplies and things like that, but also providing food assistance to the communities that are not able to receive their normal food assistance from the government due to things like road closures and all the other challenges that come along with what we've all been experiencing. So one thing that we're really good at is pivoting to address emergencies and immediate needs in the communities where we work. And so now that we have kind of the dust has settled a little bit with COVID and the unrest that we experienced over the summer, we're working with local financial institutions to create plans to help support borrowers to get back on their feet. For example, in one of the communities where we experienced a lot of flooding, we're looking at providing new productive assets for the families that were displaced from their homes from floods. And obviously we're there to support people to be successful. And so our objective is always to work with the government and the local institutions to create action plans around how to help people both get back on their feet, but then also be successful and be able to pay back their loans and really reap the benefits of the programs that we're implementing. Our ultimate goal for families is to build resilience. That's what we're really focused on, because we believe that if we can give families the tools to become resilient, that they can be successful, because we know that they're going to continue to face shocks. They're going to continue to face economic and environmental and political challenges. That's just the nature of the country that we work in. So the goal is to do things like help them diversify their income and their assets, and increase their savings so that if a shock occurs, they're able to tap into some of the resources that they have. So maybe it doesn't hit them as hard and they can recover more quickly. So that's what we're ultimately focused on. Did that answer your question? Okay, cool, thank you.
Hi, Ellen. Sorry, I have another question. Are you using any digital health tools to help to monitor the health of people in the rural areas? Or are you planning on using, or if you are using at the moment, tools that you are developing in the United States, or are you using from any other companies?
I'm sorry, I only heard a portion of that. My speakers are kind of poor quality. Would you repeat that?
Yeah, if you are using digital health technology or tools that can help you to monitor the health condition of people in the rural areas.
Are we using digital technologies? Is that
yeah, like telehealth or telemedicine.
Not that I'm aware of currently. One thing that's really interesting about Ethiopia is a few years ago, they developed this program for health due to the lack of resources they have within the health sector in the country, where they basically created like a volunteer health worker system called the Women's Development Army. And they basically took women from households and decided that they would train them to go door to door within their own communities and educate other mothers. And it's been a really effective and really interesting program, especially the woman to woman and community member to community member aspect of the program. so that's just something that's unique about Ethiopia's health system. In terms of using digital tools right now, we're not doing that. But I think that you're definitely right that there's an opportunity there to do more of that. And actually, we recently connected with an organization called Last Mile Health. They're a really cool nonprofit, and their CEO has a TED Talk about how important it is to have access to health services in rural communities. And so Last Mile Health is using a lot of virtual tools in their work to bring health services to really remote areas. And so that's another thing that we're exploring, either partnering with them or adopting some of their own best practices for our work as well. So thanks for asking. That's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question about your fundraising, especially in times like we're in now. Like, how do you find new donors and keep raising funds from like current donors or even past donors who maybe haven't donated in a while? How do you like encourage that fundraising and those donations, especially when things are a little tough right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been really challenging, to be honest. A lot of our fundraising strategy relies on making in-person connections, especially because one thing that I experienced really acutely was the difference in raising money for community-based nonprofits that help people in your own backyard versus raising money for programs that are halfway across the world. It's just a difference in delivering the message to the potential donor and why it's important. And so therefore, yeah, our strategy is really reliant on in-person connections with donors, whether that's going to international conferences or meeting people at different types of events and things like that. That's typically how we go about making those connections and getting new fundraising dollars. So when we went all online and started work from home this year, our original plans for the year kind of fell apart. But one thing that we did that has seemed to be working really, really well is we realized kind of what our barriers were and went back to the drawing board and decided to use this time working from home and not being able to connect with donors to develop a new strategic plan. So we created a 5-year strategic plan that's extremely detailed and extremely focused around all the different things that we need to do across the entire organization to become better and stronger and more effective in implementing our programs and also more aggressive in our fundraising. So we put that tool together and I'll send it to you guys just to check it out. And now we've been using that strategic plan tool as an opportunity to reach out to and connect to other potential donors and existing donors virtually and set up times to have conversations with them about our plans and kind of just exploratory conversations about how we might align with donors. Glimmer is specifically really focused on institutional donors, so foundations and corporate donors, because typically they have the ability to make multi-year gifts, which is really important for us for the scale of the work that we're doing. And like I mentioned before, they also have that component of being able to have peer learning with other grantees. So that's where our focus is. So now we're reaching out and reconnecting with some of the foundation prospects that we had our eye on to go meet in person over this year. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that tool would be really great for our club to see. So yeah, that's cool. I had another question. I let everyone else get theirs out first, but I was making notes of mine. What are some of the big goals of the work that Glimmer does? Like, obviously, ideally with any organization like this, you want to not need to exist eventually. Like, the end goal of any group like this is like, we want to start this group to never need this group. So what are some of those like big long-term goals that Glimmer has?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of that is outlined in the strategic plan that I just sent it in the chat for you guys to check out. If you go down about 60% through, we have like a chart that shows all of our immediate 5-year goals. But like you mentioned, nonprofit organizations are usually created to hopefully eventually put themselves out of business by alleviating poverty or whatever the mission is. And so our goal is to continue to work in Ethiopia for the next 20 years. But in terms of the areas that we're trying to affect change, we're very aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so we're working towards a lot of those same things that the Sustainable Development Goals are focusing on in terms of income and resources of a country. The Ethiopian government's goal is to become a middle income country by, I believe it's 2024. And so when we are creating our own plans and our own goals, we're also really focused on what the Ethiopian government is looking at as their definition of success and where they would like to be. And then we are trying to support what they're trying to do as well. But ultimately, definitely the goal is middle income. It's for, like I mentioned before, for families to be able to be resilient and respond to shocks and have the resources and the resources that they need to keep their families as stable as possible. But yeah, you can take a look at the strategic plan for a little bit more specific information on that.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you sent that. I'm like, I've already pulled it up. I'm like definitely gonna dig into that. That's really cool.
Cool, thank you. I'll chat you guys my contact info too. So if you look at that and then have any questions, you can reach out to me because it's there's a lot of detail there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we are a couple minutes past our time, but I think this is really great conversation. Good enough conversation that I didn't realize it was 9 o'clock already. Well, 8 o'clock for most of you. But thank you so much, Ellen. This was really fantastic. I have pulled the links from the chat today, so if any of y'all have not grabbed those and want them later, just let me know. But we really appreciate it. We wrap our meetings up with the 4-way test. So I'm going to give everybody a second to remember what that is while I also pull it up because it's slightly brain dead, so I'm not going to remember it today. But before we jump into that, I also want to mention very quickly World Polio Day, October 24th. There are lots of events going on in Texas. If you go to endpolio.org, you can find local events near you. Like just in the Houston area, there's Pints for Polio, there's Pies for Polio. I just sent my sister a link earlier because she lives in Conroe, and the Conroe Rotary Club is doing like a big jazz dinner. So there's some really cool stuff. There's a car wash going on in Louisville. So if you're in DFW, there's that. In Tyler, they're doing some sort of like eat out event, dining out for Polio Plus in Tyler. So lots of really cool options if y'all want to get involved. So our club is not going to do anything specifically, but I do encourage you to go to endpolio.org, find an event near you, get involved some way if possible. They're not going to lie, there aren't great events near me in North Carolina, but there are some good ones for a lot of you in the DFW, East Texas, and Houston areas. So now onto our 4-way test. Of the things that we think, say, or do, number 1.
Is it the truth?
Is it the truth?
Number 2. Is it fair
to all concerned?
Number 3.
Will it build good and better friendships?
And number 4. Will it be
beneficial to all concerned?
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We are officially adjourned. We will see you back here next week for our open forum discussion.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Okay, I caged Brittany out.
She's still cooking, probably.
Yeah, I was like, she might still be distracted.